So friends, on behalf of the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development at 𝗩𝗶𝗶 𝗪𝗏, I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished panelists and participants to this webinar on the principles for water governance in a post-COVID world. This is the seventh in the series of webinars being organized by the Chair to explore the social and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on India's most vulnerable population. Before we begin and ask our panelists to share their valuable thoughts on this theme, I would like to say a few words by way of introducing the theme for today and the issues that we would like to explore in our discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light many aspects of the crisis in humanity's relationship with water. The emphasis on washing hands and practicing personal hygiene brought into sharp relief the severe water scarcity facing millions of India's most underprivileged people in rural and urban areas. The unforeseen and rapidly escalating nature of the crisis has demonstrated the need for greater resilience in public health systems. Reliable access to water for drinking and personal hygiene is an indispensable element of this system. At a broader level, the pandemic has highlighted the extent to which social and economic life is dependent on and circumscribed by the larger ecological system, and the perils of ignoring or abusing this connection. The scarcity of water remains one of the most visible and acute manifestations of the crisis triggered by an anthropocentric worldview. The crisis of water in the present world relates into both its availability and its quality. Globally, the demand for fresh water will exceed supply by 40%. South Asia is particularly hard hit by this scarcity. Lakes, ponds, wetlands, and rivers that were the main sources of fresh water are drying up, with rising demand to cater to agriculture, industry, and the needs of fast expanding cities on the one hand, and the blockage and encroachment of catchment areas on the other. Most of these surface water bodies are also heavily polluted with industrial effluents, sewage, plastic, and other refuse. Faced with growing scarcity, millions have turned to the only other source of fresh water to meet their multiplying needs, which is subterranean aquifers. In India, water from these aquifers is being overpumped despite most areas of the country having a very low rate of natural recharge. This has resulted in fast depleting water tables, with the prospect of cities running out of groundwater in the coming decades becoming a distinct possibility. What compounds to the crisis of drying surface water bodies and the over-extraction of groundwater is the effect of climate change that threatens to alter rainfall patterns, leading to more intense and frequent droughts and floods. In addressing the challenge of water stress, there is the need to be also sensitive to the way existing social and economic inequalities affect access to water. Those who are most economically deprived in the country, in rural areas or urban informal settlements, are also the worst hit by the scarcity and contamination of water. It is usually women who are worst affected by water scarcity. They are forced to travel long distances or stand for hours in long queues for water. This leaves them with much less time for attending school, childcare, farming, and other income-generating activities. In many parts of the country, people are deprived of access to water on the basis of caste. This discrimination is often institutionalized through the limited representation of women and those categorized as belonging to lower castes in institutions of water governance. To contribute to enduring change will thus require a fundamental reconceptualization of our relationship not only with water but also with our fellow human beings. It will have to be based on a more profound consciousness of the interconnectedness of all life and of the oneness of existence. Water is a common resource that is the shared heritage of all humanity. Unlike land, it cannot be divided or partitioned, yet most of the existing policies and rules that govern its use ignore its shared nature and treat it as a commodity to be owned, traded, and managed. A more mature and sustainable conception of the relationship between humanity and the natural world can be found in the principle of stewardship. To be a steward is not to own a resource, but rather to be a conscious and conscientious trustee of a heritage that belongs to humanity as a whole across generations. When applied to the context of humanity's relationship with water, this would require a reconceptualization of the governance of water and of the role that individuals, institutions, and communities play in this process. This webinar seeks to explore the contours of a new paradigm for water governance based on the principles of environmental stewardship, justice, and the oneness of existence. It seeks to bring together empirical insights and the learning from promising prototypes to show the way forward towards a more sustainable water future. So before going ahead, I would like to mention to our participants that they can share their comments and questions with the panelists through the Q&A option, which they have access to, and we will have time for discussion after the first two speakers, and then again once the fourth speaker has shared her thoughts. So our first presentation today will be by Professor Vishal Narayan. Vishal is a professor of public policy and governance at the Management Development Institute in Gurgaon. His academic interests are in the interdisciplinary analysis of public policy, processes and institutions, gender, rights and equity issues in water governance, peri-urban issues, and adaptation and vulnerability to climate change. So without taking more time, I would request Vishal to share his comments.
So thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the Bahá'i Chair for Studies on Development for this opportunity. Nice to be connected again with colleagues that we've known for quite a while. So I have a short presentation, and looking at the way the presentations and talks are structured, I get the impression that it will serve as some kind of a role in setting the context and setting the conceptual groundwork for the kinds of issues that all four of us as panelists would like to share. So please allow me a minute to share my screen, and yeah. Okay. Yeah, so can we all see my screen? Yes. Yeah, okay. All right, so I've titled this talk Seeing Water Differently, and what I want to do really is to make a connect with the concept of narratives that we use very widely in development and in public policy, trying to make a point that how we see a problem is very fundamental to what kind of solutions we propose. And in the context of the COVID pandemic, there is an opportunity to question some of our basic assumptions of what constitutes India's water crisis, and use this as an opportunity to see water differently, or to present an alternative narrative of India's water crisis, and then to look at what kinds of solutions, what kinds of paradigmatic departures are needed to tackle the challenges that we are facing now. So first, a few comments about why think about water in a post-COVID world, and the concept note that was shared in preparation for this webinar put it very nicely. And if you look at all the kinds of things that we have been reading about the pandemic in the newspaper for exactly 1 year now, the pandemic has played an important role in drawing attention to social differences in our society, to the unequal access to infrastructure and resources. So for instance, we talked much more about the informal sector in the last 1 year than most of us consciously did before that. And there is a very strong connect there with issues of unequal access, which are important in the context of water scarcity or water security. And I will argue that this unequal access is of course a basic determinant of the water insecurity that we experience in India, and that is why recognizing that unequal access has to be a point of departure for how we think about tackling the water crisis. Yeah, and of course, as was also said a few minutes ago, the pandemic again reinforced the importance of access to safe water for hygiene and washing hands. And in general, I think most of us personally and professionally have done a lot of soul searching about how we want to reprioritize our life, what would we do differently in our personal life, in our professional lives. And in a way, the pandemic gives us one more reason to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong and what can be correct? So we've been talking about coming back to a new normal. We still don't know when that will be, but what will this new normal be? Are we going to go back to all our old ways, or are we still going to want to do some things differently, even though, you know, the quote unquote, the new normal has been reached? So at this point, I would like to, I'm a professor, and professors have their own hobby horses, and they have their own favorite concepts. And one of mine is the concept of narratives. And, you know, as children, we all grow up listening to stories. And so it's not a concept that's very difficult to relate with. But in the development literature, in the public policy literature, we basically say that a narrative is a story that policymakers tell themselves and others to legitimize policy choices. Yeah. So a narrative is basically a story with a moral. It's like when we grew up listening to Aesop's fables, or, you know, grandma stories, and when the grandmother tells us a story, she asks, so what did we learn from this? And we say, well, we learned that slow but steady wins a race, or we learned that, you know, don't count your eggs before they hatch, and so on and so forth. So a narrative is basically a story. It is some presentation of causality, some representation of cause-effect relationships that tells us what the problem is out there. Yeah, and this framing of the problem, this way that we present the problem, this way that we present what the problem is very fundamental to identifying what kinds of policy choices we have, what are the appropriate ways of intervening. And therefore, the first kind of frame of reference in thinking about policy choices is the framing of the problem itself. And that is why, to my mind, the starting point of all analysis of public policy is really analyzing what the underpinning narrative is. What is this framing of the problem? What is this articulation of the cause-effect relationship? And in my book, Public Policy, A View from the South, that was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, I've argued that you can see the process of policy choice, you can see the process of policy evolution over time by looking at it as a struggle among different competing narratives. Yes, so this concept of narratives is very basic to understanding how we look at water, how we look at water problems, and correspondingly then what are the different kinds of solutions we see to address them. Now, in a paper that I wrote in GeoForum with Sameer Shah, we basically argued that historically in India, we've seen the water crisis as a physical one. Yes, and we've assumed that water scarcity is really a physical problem. And so we talk about ways to address the water crisis in terms of technological or physical solutions, which would be in terms of supply augmentation, building new infrastructure, laying down pipes, and other ways of provisioning water. And what we argued in that paper is that we need to reframe our understanding of the water crisis as predominantly a crisis of distribution, as predominantly a crisis of unequal access, because water crisis is not the same for everyone. So I live in a gated colony in Gurgaon, and in the 5 years that I've been in this house, every time I open the tap in my kitchen, I have running water. But right across where I live, there are informal settlements. There's still some pockets of rural areas where people struggle for water. People may have to queue up for water. So water is physically there, yeah, but there is a problem of how it is accessed. So in that sense, the water crisis needs to be seen, at least in large part, as an institutional one, which will bring to fore the kinds of distributional issues that, once again, the COVID pandemic has drawn our attention to. And therefore, this is really an opportunity to look at what are the different ways in which we can consciously work at understanding the unequal distribution of water, but also what kinds of partnerships, what kinds of interventions are needed in order to correct these kinds of imbalances. Okay, and now I want to talk about the value of looking at water through a gendered lens. And I'm not talking about gender because it's rhetoric, it's cliche, it's fashionable. But I want to talk about gender because when we talk about unequal access to water, gender is the most basic access of social differentiation. Yes, and looking at my own interface, looking at my own studies on gender and water, I'd like to mention that I never really started off with a gendered lens consciously, but gender was so basic to water that whenever I studied water in the field, whenever I did water research, it always came up. Yeah. So one of the things that perhaps we need a conscious focus on is how do we sensitize state agencies? How do we sensitize the providers of water to look at water provisioning not simply as a task of infrastructure creation, but also to look at water provisioning from a conceptual lens that looks at gender with its other intersectionalities. Yes, so gender in itself does not give us the complete picture, but as an analytic tool, gender becomes relevant when you look at it along with other axes of social differentiation. Now, one of the things that I also notice a lot in talking to policymakers, in talking to other people who work on gender, is that somehow the word gender is equated with women. So if you tell somebody that if you tell someone that so-and-so is a gender expert, he or she assumes implicitly that she works on women's issues. Yeah, and this is a very big, to my mind, it's a very big conceptual fallacy, and especially when interacting with state agencies, this somehow jumps to the conclusion that gender is about women's issues. But it's not. It's about the differences between men and women. It's about, when you look at water from a gendered lens, you're trying to understand how men and women have different experiences in relation to water. Yeah. So if you want to talk about distribution issues, if you want to talk about unequal access to water, if you want to talk about social differentiation, gender is really, to my mind, a very important conceptual entry point. Yeah, but not in itself, in relation, but particularly in relation to other axes of social differentiation. And something that we did recently in collaboration with the Tea School of Advanced Studies, which we found immensely valuable, was a series of management development programs where we sensitized state agencies in 5 different cities in India who were engaged in provisioning water to look at gender in their work. And one of the interesting points that came up during one of the workshops was one of the engineers said that, why are we talking about gender? Now, what is natural should be left to be natural. And then it took a lot of explaining to say that there was nothing natural about gender. Yeah, but the gender was a social construct. Yes. But in looking at how water is provided and looking at how water is distributed, gender is to my mind, a very important, perhaps the most important conceptual entry point. Right. The other thing is that that I think that's important, which also connects and which gives us some hope that in the future, water will be seen differently, is the changing nature of water resources education in the country. Now, what I want to say here is that conventionally and historically, the large chunk of India's water professionals, especially those that man state agencies, were trained as civil engineers. Yes, and I think that is why, that is possibly why we see that technical orientation, that focus on supply augmentation, that focus on infrastructure creation and provisioning. But in the recent years, the nature of water resources education has changed, and many institutes in India and in South Asia have moved to interdisciplinary water resource programs. So I can think of the Tea School of Advanced Studies, I can think of the Shiv Nadar University. I know TIS does interdisciplinary water programs. And the good news there is that this means that the future generation of water professionals will see water in a more interdisciplinary way. We'll look at water not only in terms of provisioning and supply and infrastructure, but we'll be able to look at water more in terms of what the governance challenges are, what the important distributional issues are. Yes. And other than that, even within conventional engineering programs, I know of 4 such initiatives in South Asia, and SAFA is here, and a lot of this work was led by Saki Waters, which was in reorienting conventional engineering-oriented water resources education into interdisciplinary programs. And this happened in 4 South Asian institutes, with an effort to also bring in more female students at the master's level. So I think that one of the important implications of this, which I think is a good sign also, is that the next generation of water professionals will be more interdisciplinary, will be able to take a better perspective on water than looking merely at the supply side, at the engineering and the technological issue. So I think this was the second issue that I wanted to talk about. It connects, I think, nicely with the overall argument about seeing water differently. So if the nature of water resources education changes, what we see as water sector, what we see as constituting the water problems, what we see as constituting the water crisis will also change. The third thing that I want to talk about, also stemming from my own research, is about steering away from the conventional way that we talk about water in terms of rural water supply and urban water supply. And in the last 2 decades or so, a lot of studies in India, but also in the global South, show how rural-urban boundaries are constantly blurring. Yes, so it's not easy always to classify areas neatly as rural or urban by the conventional criteria that we usually talk about. And with the growing body of literature on the peri-urban in the global South, has challenged the view that rural and urban water supply are kind of disjoint conceptual or planning entities. And a lot of the research in South Asia shows the close linkages between rural and urban water supply, how a lot of the expansion of urban water supply takes place at the expense of the rural water sources. So for instance, when we talk about the loss of the water commons to support big cities, the loss of the water commons like tanks, lakes, and wetlands, right? The flow of water from rural to urban areas by way of water tankers, growing competition over groundwater. So I think one of the arguments I want to make also in terms of seeing water differently is to no longer see it as distinct rural and urban water supply, but find ways of integrating that in planning and in water provisioning. And for me also, I think that the pandemic is just one more reason to focus on peri-urban spaces, to focus on this mixed rural-urban landscape. Because if you look at Gurgaon, for instance, a large number of what were listed as containment zones, even today, are what we call these urban clusters. So these are village areas in the middle of cities where both rural and urban characteristics and features are present. And these are areas characterized by high population density, poor access to water and infrastructure, a strong movement between the settlement areas and other cities and other parts of the country. And of course, the prevalence of the informal sector, and wage earners. So I think this is the third point I want to make in terms of seeing water differently. So then how do we translate these ideas into practice? So I think it's very important to sensitize water planners, managers, researchers, especially state water provisioning agencies on aspects of gender and intersectionalities. Important to emphasize and to take forward current efforts to reform water resources curricula to move towards more interdisciplinary water resources education. Yeah, and that's very important in terms of how the future generation of water professionals sees water, right? Recognize rural-urban links in water resources and planning, very important, and is strong advocacy, strong efforts to challenge and halt the encroachment and acquisition of water commons, lakes, wetlands, ponds, and tanks for urban expansion. So a lot of this work is being done by some NGOs, but I think that's extremely important. And finally, I think we need stronger partnerships between academics, researchers, state agencies, and civil society organizations in researching and documenting the causes of unequal access to water, supporting action research to correct the imbalances. So with that, I will stop, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Vishal, for this this very stimulating presentation, which really has set the tone, I think, for the thinking and the deliberation that will that we will have during these next hour and a half. I think the question, I mean, I'm sure the presentation has stimulated us to think along the lines of transcending or questioning conventional or certain ways of conceptualizing water and water management, water governance, and what are ways in which one begins to step outside those narratives. And in a sense, you've provided certain conceptual starting points to begin that looking at an alternative way of thinking. I hope in the discussion ahead, one of the questions that I'm sure because of the lack of time, maybe you didn't have sufficient time to explore, but it would also be helpful to see this question of how communities think of water. I mean, what are the other narratives which need to be recognized and need to inform the discourse and practice that derive from people's own understanding, their own relationships. But before going into discussion, maybe we listen to one more enlightening presentation. The next speaker is Mr. Vijay Shankar. He is the Director of Research and a founding member of Samaj Pragati Sahayog, an NGO based in Devas district in Madhya Pradesh. And he has written extensively on rural issues and on issues related to water. So without taking more time, I invite Vijay to please share his comments. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here on this occasion to be with this Baha'i Center. As you know, I work in Devas. I'm next door to you. So I'm 1 minute. I'm working with the Devas, Madhya Pradesh. So I'm actually next door neighbor to you, though I never visited the center. Next time when I'm there back, I'll definitely come and like to see you. I thank Dr. Arash and Vishal for laying out that vast canvas about how to look at water in the context of a pandemic. I mean, any crisis, any disaster, any major break in history is a time for rethink. I mean, there's a saying which I've heard somebody quote recently saying that never waste a crisis. Crisis always gives you opportunity to think afresh. And it's a kind of path dependency of our interventions can break if you think through the crisis and think about it differently. That's the way I look at the COVID pandemic. I don't particularly feel that COVID has unearthed any new priority. What it has done is that it has brought into the open, like Dr. Arash mentioned in his opening address, that all the points are covered there. The unequal access to water, which was always there, which was brought into a very sharp focus by this pandemic crisis. Especially when we have these images, when you talk about the narrative that Vishal spoke about, you have the narratives which come from the media, like you have the thousands and thousands of migrants walking across on the road without water, without food, without anything. We knew that there were some 8 million or whatever number, 15 million migrants are there in urban areas, but we never had a visual image of what that would actually mean. And the pandemic is brought that into the focus. And also the unequal access to water, that between rural and urban, within rural, between gender. The water access is divided. I mean, Joy will be talking about that. The unequal access to water across the social spectrum has always been there, but has been brought out into the open by the COVID crisis. And it also brought sharply into focus that what we think about natural resources like water, naturally occurring substances like water, we tend to think about them as being infinite or unlimited in supply. So this COVID crisis sharply brought into focus the idea that water is a scarce commodity, a scarce substance, that it is can be subjected to depletion and degradation and even exhaustion, as in some cases. So that's what the crisis has basically done. And if you look at the water sector, I mean, I'm stepping a bit away from India. If you look at water in general, the approaches to water, you can contrast between two major dominant, using Arash's term, I can say paradigms. One is an extractive paradigm, which is not only for water, for all natural resources in general, whether it is forest or even soil, or even as people living in Delhi would say, atmospheric air quality. These are all things which are around us, we take for granted. In an extractive kind of framework, extractive kind of approach, we focus on taking as much of this as possible and making use of it for human beings, particularly that anthropocentric view which Dr. Arash mentioned, or the depriving, even within that also, within the human community also, favoring some and not favoring others. So that's what the extractive approach has done, and implications of that, the impact of that is very visible in many places, particularly in the form of groundwater overexhaustion or depletion of soils, deforestation, which is happening at a very large scale, glacier melting, which is actually leading to the kind of floods that you recently saw in Uttarakhand, and not to speak of COVID itself. It itself, I mean, there's one view to say that COVID itself is a outcome. The zoonotic diseases which are coming up are themselves an outcome of a certain way that we have dealt with nature and natural resources and tried to use it only for human purposes. So compared to that extractive kind of perspective, you can contrast it with what can be called an ecosystem view or a regenerative view of water, which actually leads to the notion that again was mentioned in the opening address as water stewardship, or being having respect for water, paying respect for what we have got. So in that ecosystem, or that non-extractive or regenerative view of water, water is not a resource which is kept there primarily for human consumption. Water is a naturally occurring substance. It's part of an ecosystem, and it follows the principles that guide the ecosystem. We know about hydrological cycle. It follows that cycle, and it's available. It's there for not only for us, for everybody. So from that point of view, if you look at it from the point of view of stewardship, it's our duty to protect water and sort of preserve it for the generations to come. That is what generally the change in approach that I think, which has already been mentioned before COVID, but I think the pandemic would make us think more because of this unequal access and the growing scarcity of water, degradation of water. Water quality also you mentioned, however, water quality has gone down. So I would say that these priorities, which have already been there, need to be restated in the context of COVID. So I'll mention 5 critical areas. I mean, there are other speakers will be mentioning many more areas. Some have already been mentioned. From my own experience, I'll speak about 5 critical areas where this kind of water rethinking is required. And first and foremost is agriculture water management. That is because if you look at globally, or if you look at in Indian context, or even you take a village where I work in Narmada Valley, 80 to 90% of the total water demand comes from agriculture. The agriculture accounts for that much use of water. So you talk about drinking water, the requirement for drinking water in terms of actual quantum of water is only about 5% or something. But to ensure that 5%, you have to think how the 90% has been managed or the 90% has been used. The kind of agriculture paradigm which has come up in India after Green Revolution, the mid-60s, which has run for about last 30, 40 years, it clearly has led to a certain kind of a cropping pattern, a cropping system, which emphasizes overuse of water. And if you actually go into the irrigated agriculture and look at the agriculture crops which require water, you find that 80 to 80% of the total water use in agriculture is accounted for by just 3 crops. You have paddy, you have wheat, and you have sugarcane. These 3 crops together take up around 80% of the total water use in the country. And as you know, sugarcane in Maharashtra, I need not speak much about it. Joy is already here. He has worked with that context a lot. He knows it more thoroughly. But if you took up paddy in a state like Punjab, Punjab was a dryland area some 150, 200 years ago, converted into irrigated agriculture later on. Now, in such a time with very high evaporation rates, around kind of time of May itself, paddy has become a main crop in a state like Punjab, leading to a lot of overuse of water, what can be called water guzzling. So how do we move away from this water guzzler crops, 3 crops which take up a lot of water, and focus on crops which have been neglected as directly as a consequence of the Green Revolution paradigm? Like we have talked about millets. You are sitting in Madhya Pradesh. There are lots of oil seeds are grown in Madhya Pradesh. Millets are there, pulses are there. How do we shift emphasis towards these crops? If you do that, I think not only helps the farmers, the poorer farmers who grow such crops, it also helps us in terms of water, because these crops require very little water. Most of them are rain-fed crops. Little bit of supplementary irrigation they can be done. The management of water use in agriculture is a very big area, which I think we need to give priority attention to. And the second area which I would mention is groundwater management. Aquifers have been mentioned already. Groundwater, also the same extractive paradigm has been operational in groundwater from 1960s onwards, along with the time when the Green Revolution started. We have been using pump sets to extract water from open dug wells. Then we started digging bore wells, and bore well depths are increasing every day. The latest minor irrigation census data shows that Punjab, there are no open wells. Punjab, the top state, has completely got exhausted. People are actually going down into deeper aquifers. Madhya Pradesh, where we are sitting, you are sitting in Malwa. I did not tell you where does the Malwa water from Indore come from. Indore had a lot of borewells earlier. The water for drinking water that people sitting in Indore drink, that comes from Narmada River, which is 1500 feet below the level at which you are. So that kind of thing is happening, and groundwater extraction, over extraction has become a very big reality in India as a whole. There have been approaches. I mean, we have been talking about it and writing about it for the last 10, 15 years or so. We need to move into a framework of something what can be called an aquifer management framework. You have to clearly map out our rock strata, understand the properties of the rock strata, assess how much water actually is there, depending on that, derive protocols for sustainable and participatory community-based management of groundwater. That kind of approach is required. And at a national level, even government has come up with a program also called 𝗪𝗔𝗔 which is operating on these principles. And also there is a Groundwater Act, which is in the offing, but it has not occurred yet. So groundwater management is a second, I would say, the large area where we need to prioritize our interventions and work, especially in places like western part of India, which are underlain by hard rocks, and the groundwater availability is highly uneven and insecure. Third one, again, which is very large area that one should be paying attention to, is the status of our rivers and wetlands. Mention has already been made. In fact, I'm sure Joy will be speaking more about it. We call rivers the arteries of India, and we call wetlands the lungs of India. Forests and wetlands are the lungs of India. But what are we doing to our blood circulation system, our arteries and lungs? What are we doing to them? And they are in a state of deep disrepair. our rivers have literally been converted into drains. I mean, they are in technical engineering language, they are called drainage lines. They are actually becoming drains carrying wastewater and so on. And very close to us, I mean, India has a long tradition of respecting rivers. Again, to talk about stewardship, there's a long tradition in India of respecting rivers as holy entities. Ganga is a holy river, Narmada is a holy river, so many holy rivers are there. But even then, after doing all that, in summer, you go to Narmada river, you will be shocked by the level of water level which is there in that river, which is so low, and so much of over extraction is happening, so much of pollution is happening. The river is in a state of great danger, and there has been movements like Save Narmada movement, etc. We need more such movements to protect the rivers from getting degraded and destroyed. That's the third area which I would like to mention. Fourth is ensuring drinking water security. The COVID crisis has exposed the lack of availability of drinking water to large sections of people, and that has become a priority. And we now have a very large, by far the largest rural development program ever, called the 𝗩𝗵𝗋𝗆 mission, with a specific objective of providing water to rural areas. That program is taking on, but we are still far away from the issue of drinking water security. As I mentioned, for drinking water, we need only 5% of the total water, but the actual the rest of the water is being used by other systems. So unless you protect that 80% of water which goes into agriculture, even the 5% cannot be protected. And lastly, but a very important point again, is that the role of state comes in here, is that of legislating on groundwater. I mean, groundwater laws, or water laws in general, not only groundwater. If you talk about the water in the, I mean, if you treat water as a common property or an open access resource or something which is common to all to be used by everyone, the legal framework around water is extremely weak. We have laws, we have a national framework law which has been prepared by a lot of people, and Joy is right now involved in writing the national water policy. Many of those legal aspects have come up. Groundwater, India has been trying to legislate on groundwater from 1970 onwards. Even now, we have a large groundwater law which has been passed, I think, or waiting to be passed. But implementation of this have been very, very poor. So unless you have if you want to protect water, if you want to have a respectful attitude, develop a respectful attitude towards water, a legislative framework is very important. And that's where I think government comes in a big way. So these are the 5 priority areas which I would like to mention. There will be many more, but in my view, at least, I would flag these as a critical areas. And again, as I was saying, these are not areas which have suddenly come up. They have already been there. They have been craving for attention. The COVID pandemic has exposed the weakness of our water management system and has brought these priorities into the foreground. And it's not for us now to act on it in whichever way we can. That's what I would say. With those things, I would thank you once again, and I'll end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay, for this, for really, in a sense, also mapping out for us some of the most critical issues in the context of India. I mean, the crisis caused by the way we practice agriculture. The 5 priority areas. The first one is this green revolution model of agriculture, which is based on growing these water guzzling crops, and you laid out the need for the illogical and ecologically unsound policies that actually created the crisis. Growing paddy in Punjab, for example, based on free subsidized electricity, and in a sense, we actually created the condition that caused the crisis. And the other 4 points, groundwater management, the status of our rivers and wetlands. So I think there are some questions. We've had 2 very stimulating. The first one is directed to Vishal. What do you think would help in changing the narrative around water resources from a very technical, engineering-oriented perspective to a broader perspective? One thing might be the university programs you mentioned, but are there other pathways to reframing the dominant narrative? So I don't know. I mean, if you would like to share.
Yes, no, that's an interesting question, but obviously not with a very clear-cut answer. So, when you look at the concept of narratives, and when you look at how narratives change, you find that narratives change when a new evidence is presented. Yeah, so like the dominant narrative in agriculture in the 70s and 80s was of the Green Revolution. Of using high-yielding varieties of seeds, chemical fertilizers, irrigation. And over time, when we saw that that was not sustainable, now we talk of new paradigms. We talk of organic farming. We say that people should have, terrace, kitchen gardens in their home and so on and so forth. So I think that broadly narratives change when we produce new alternative evidence and present it in a convincing and a persuasive way. So perhaps one way is to demonstrate through research and then use that as a basis of advocacy to show what these distributional inequalities are. Yeah, what are the institutions that create these patterns of inequality? So perhaps more systematic scientific evidence, documentation, and advocacy would possibly be the ways forward. As I said, no clear-cut answer, but this is what comes to my mind. Yeah.
Yes, Vijay, would you like to share in?
Yeah, there was one question about talking about the pressure on local water resources by 𝗪𝗫𝗀𝗃𝗏. So he is asked a question about local water resources, the pressure on local water resources by migrating population. The point is that migration has been a circular kind of thing in India. After the pandemic, a lot of people came back to the rural areas, but they went away from the rural areas in the first place because there is nothing in the rural areas to support them. So they have been there for some time, and with the towns opening up and etc., many of the migrants, we did some surveys recently as part of a different network. So we got to know that something like 70 to 80% of the migrants have gone back to urban areas. So this is a thing which is a transitory kind of thing which goes on. People temporarily come back. It might put a pressure on the local resources, but I don't think those migrant people are going to stay there for very long because they left the place in the first place because there was nothing for them to hang on to in the villages. I think it's going to be a circulatory phenomenon. It's not going to significantly affect the way we look at water, but whatever the general crisis is, that it definitely would deepen. And just kind of thousands of people walking on the road without water, without food is an image, I think, with an abiding image of COVID, which I think is going to remain. When Vishal talks about narratives, I hope that gets into the mainstream narrative and tries to change the way we look at water in a fundamental way. The question about 𝗪𝗏, what 𝗪𝗏 has asked is very interesting. There has been experiments, led by institutions like 𝗙𝗶𝗊𝗪, of using solar power and trying to shift to that as a way of saving groundwater. I think the result of that is very mixed. I've gone to some of those areas also, but in general, it's not very clear how the shift to solar power has, or using solar power as a commodity, really helped the protection of groundwater. For that matter, even this the grid separation also, the impact of that on groundwater is still, I think the jury is a bit out on that. What actually happens if you get more power. But more interesting aspect of 𝗪𝗏's question is the role of technology. Technology is something which can actually solve or something ameliorate or something reduce human problems. But unfortunately, technologies like borewells, because they have gone beyond a certain level now, they are actually causing a lot more problem. There is also, in South India in particular, where borewell irrigation has been came in much earlier, there have been cases where well failures have repeatedly pushed people back into poverty. And the kind of examples which I mentioned about Punjab right now, and also many states like Andhra Pradesh also, where the top aquifer is almost empty. The fifth, my census shows that open wells are actually declining in number because the top level aquifer is getting over, and people are even going deeper and deeper into the ground, extracting more and more groundwater. So their technology, I think, definitely does a lot of harm to us. So I think using technology, any technological fix to solve the problem of water is not going to work. We need to have a kind of a total integrated kind of social approach to water, taking into account all the conflicts which are happening within the society, as well as the overall approach. What is the approach that we take? Even technology also comes with a certain kind of a paradigm or an approach. If technology is still used in the extractive paradigm and not in the regenerative way, I think it's only going to cause more harm than good. Yeah. I think there's one more question. I think Vishwarji has asked one question to Vishal also.
Yes, there's a question
Yeah.
I don't know if Vishal, you want to comment on.
So it says translating the scientific knowledge, for example, the aquifer characteristics into layperson's language is also challenging. How can this be achieved better? Any ideal example of this? Okay, so nothing that comes to my mind, but I will connect this with the question that Professor 𝗪𝗃 Fazli had also raised earlier about listening to communities' narratives. So I think that it is also the other way around is important. So, you know, as researchers and academics and professionals, our language is really a Western language, is a Western scientific language. And there's often a problem of translating that into the field, like when we talk to communities, when we do our research. And what I figured out in my own research and fieldwork is that you have to start the other way. So you have to look at what the community, what the people are saying, yeah, interpret that, and then translate it into your scientific discourse. So communities may not understand what the word climate change means or what an aquifer is, but they will still have ways of talking about it. So you have to listen to them. And then you have to say, well, in the scientific discourse, what does it mean? So once we had a project on climate change and water security, and people started saying that earlier we used to celebrate Diwali in the winters, yeah? And now when it's Diwali, it's still summertime. So basically, which meant that they're experiencing longer summers. And for us, that is what we were looking at. We wanted to see how they were experiencing a changing climate. So it's important to listen to communities' narratives and then try to translate it into our own scientific discourse so that it's brought to a common language and common meaning. But also important to deconstruct community in itself. We often talk of community as if it's one monolith, as if it's one whole, but there are a lot of differences there. So while we recognize that community narratives are important, it's also important to understand that there is not like one community there with one narrative, but a lot of differences there with possibly competing narratives about the same situation.
Yeah, I would just like to add one point. I mean, an example which I think Ishwarji will know very well is that of organizations working in Gujarat, in Kutch, particularly ACT, etc. They have made there is an arid communities and technologies as an NGO there. They have done a lot of work in trying to translate because they had a geologist at the heading the organization. They've actually done a lot of effort in trying to translate technical parameters like geological characteristics like transmissivity, storativity, etc., into the language that people understand, and try to use people's terms to understand the local geological situation, like the terms that people normally use for different types of rocks. Instead of using basalt or something, you talk it whatever kala pathar, the way we call it in Malwa. I mean, using those kind of terms. Yeah. There have been such instances, yeah.
I don't know if the other two panelists have any comments. Joy, Safa, if you would like to share any thoughts on these questions. I think one, like just adding on to what has been shared, I think it's very interesting to think of this idea of translation. In other words, you recognize that there are ideas, there are beliefs, and there is an understanding in local communities, and that one finds a way to translate those concepts into scientific discourse, technical discourse.
Yeah.
But it also raises, yes, it just raises for me this question of agency, because you see, at the end of the day, the question also is, how do communities take ownership? For example, Vijay is working with these tribal belts in Madhya Pradesh. They had ownership. You see, these were they had a worldview within which everything, like you were saying, the extractive and the ecosystem view. Well, that view existed. Now, one doesn't have to romanticize and say that it was a glorious, perfect world. There were many challenges with that worldview, but there were also many things which we threw out in the process of adopting this technocratic approach. So then it's just, I'm just throwing this in to stir the pot a little. The question of how knowledge and agency are related. In other words, if you see, I take charge of my own destiny when I have confidence in my knowledge about my world. But the first step in disempowering me is when my knowledge is discounted, and I have to understand my own reality in terms of someone else's world. Again, which is not to say that one is putting aside all that science and technology gives us, but how can a synergy somehow be brought in? Joy wanted to share something, and please.
I just want to build on the discussion, and I completely agree with the views expressed by both Vishal and Vijay to the issue, and also what you said about knowledge and agency. I think it's an important issue. I just want to bring in two minor things. One is that when we talk about technology, I think it is also part of an effort to depoliticize the water sector, which we see increasingly from the 1990s. I'm just putting it very broadly. We need to get into broad. And one way of doing is technifying everything. Even hardcore redistributive issues are being technified, saying that technology can solve everything. I think so. We need to watch out that. I also say that technology, science are important, but unless technology is tied to a social need or a social articulation of what you want to do, there's an issue there. The second, just a very small insight, which we have been doing in the villages, is that this whole question of translating scientific knowledge into day-to-day life and what people are used to and things. Now, all of us are used to, let's say, water balance studies and water budgeting and a whole lot of things. But we use a very simple term. In fact, I borrow from my own colleague, 𝗏𝗏 actually brought in saying that. But if you can explain the entire question of water balance, saying that, aap kamai and baap kamai, or baap public ma kamai. Aap kamai means that the water you get in your annual cycle, which you call flow, whether we can live or meet our needs within that. And people do understand, aap kamai. And if people don't know that, if you can't live within your means, like what your aap kamai is, what happens to you? So if you dig into your, baap or ma kamai, which means the type of resources which you have stored as stock for thousands of years, like, for example, what Vijay said about groundwater extraction, for example, that you are digging into your, so many generations of, resource which you have this. And then you can craft institutional rules saying that, okay, in bad years or highly drought prone years or continuous droughts and things, probably you can dip into your stock. But with the understanding, communities understand you have to replenish that in good rainfall years. So there are ways of doing this, and people do understand some of these things, provided we can talk the language people are used to it and things. Yeah, that's it, sir. Thank you.
There is one more question for Vishal. It is interesting how discourses, narratives are shaped and reshaped by evidences, experiences. Co-production of knowledge is suggested to be one alternative to address the mainstream paradigm. In this context, based on your experience, how will you think of co-production as a process?
I'm not really sure what he means by co-production. I'm not sure if I'm getting it correctly. Can anyone help with that?
I don't know if I can take a grab at it, if it helps. Yes. In the discussion. I think co-production in the sense that how does different, again, to use a very fashionable term nowadays, like, different stakeholders come together to produce the knowledge.
Yeah.
It's not only just limited to, academics or the way we used to do this one, but you bring in, let's say, fishers, agriculturists, etc.
Yeah, I think it's primarily about communities. How do we co-produce with communities?
In a disaggregated manner, bring them into a co-production of knowledge.
Yeah.
Probably, I think that.
So that they have ownership. Yeah. It's not. It's not.
Yeah. So I think then you have to look at. I think then there are questions of power among different so-called co-producers. You have to look at who those dominant co-producers are. So if we, so the way this question is framed, and Yeah, is about, it says how discourses, narratives are shaped and reshaped by evidence and experiences, but then co-production of knowledge, if I then interpret it to mean that this kind of knowledge is jointly produced by different stakeholders, then I think that I think it's really a question of politics. It's a question of the politics of knowledge creation. It's a question of, it's a question of how the dominant discourses and narratives change over time. And then that's where you have to address questions of who the dominant voices are, what is the balance of power among the different stakeholders. Sometimes it may mean, again, challenging the hegemony of vested interests. Sometimes it may mean challenging the hegemony of the dominant scientific Western paradigm. But if we interpret co-production to mean this kind of process, and I think it's really a question of politics and power, of the balance of power among the different actors. Yes.
Yeah, I would entirely agree with that. I think co-production, just having dialogue with community or taking community voice, that alone is not enough. I mean, it can even come as a, like you write in academic paper, it can come as an appendix. Community said also this. I mean, the question is that how does the relationship of power, what is the way it is dealt with, and is the traditional knowledge or community knowledge given equal importance as that of any other form of knowledge? Are you respecting community knowledge or no? Or are you just taking them as object of study or stakeholders, as Joy used the term? I mean, are they respondents or stakeholders? I mean, are you taking them as participants or respondents? That may be the question. Yeah, it's essentially a question of power.
There is an approach developing saying that SPSI, that is what you call science policy stakeholder interaction, as a way of co-producing this knowledge. Of course, I grant the point both of you raised about power and hierarchy and all type of things are there. So yeah.
Yeah, I have one small illustration. In the same climate change project, there was this constant tension within the research team on what to take seriously. So if you listen to community narratives about climate change, do we go by that? Or do we go by the climatological data and the hydrometeorological analysis? So when both of them were reinforcing each other, it was easy. Yeah. It was like triangulation. But when the community narratives about the climate change are very different from what the hydrometeorological data was suggesting, then there was a lot of tension within the project team. Like, whom do we believe? Is it just community perception? I said, no, it can't be perception. They're not dreaming. They're not having hallucinations. This is the social meaning that they attach to climate change. So, yeah, that was one example that came to my mind in talking about this kind of discussion.
I just want to add another thing about the whole co-production of knowledge that comes about. It is like, while you might want to think it's a co-production process, it is also, like you were saying, influenced by the power dynamics within it. It can become a thing of who's co-producing this co-production. It can become such that becomes a form of reinforcing that dominance of an ideology and getting acceptance and saying, oh, there is buy-in, we have shared it, they have accepted. It becomes another form of co-opting and passing on a dominant for somebody else narrative and changing the dynamics for the people, and in a way that disempowers. Who is holding this dominant narrative? There is also a strong role that media plays in reinforcing these ideologies. So it's always political. Even choices of technology, which are considered to depoliticize the way we think about water governance, are also choices made by a group of people in reinforcing certain kinds of technology that we are using, certain kinds of infrastructure, certain kinds of systems. Like there's this thing that we want infrastructure, we like infrastructure and technology to solve the problems, but also which problems are we solving and which problems we're not solving with technology. That becomes also a conversation that comes in.
Yeah.
So that's just part of what I wanted to throw in there.
Thank you, Safa. It goes back, I think, to how Vishal started the discussion, which is, your narratives tell you what problem you see. In other words, in a sense, it goes back to there is a knowledge system that and there are interests and values of certain interests that are behind a certain reading of the problem, which then proposes a solution to that problem. But I think it's now it's a good point in our discussion to move on. Our next speaker today is Mr. 𝗪𝗁𝗁. He is one of the founding members and currently a senior fellow of the Society for Promoting Participative Ecosystem Management, and he has been an activist and researcher for more than 30 years now in this field. Welcome, Mr. Joy.
Yeah. Am I audible properly?
Yes, yes.
Yes, 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 sure.
So thanks, Arish, and also I'm thankful to Bahá'i Chair of Studies and Development of the 𝗩𝗶𝗀𝗵𝗋 for organizing a very interesting webinar on a very important topic. I think probably this is the first time I'm participating in a webinar. I'm sure that maybe would have been there, but I think in a focused manner on a, using this context of pandemic to relook at the water sector and reconceptualization and things. So I'm really thankful that you organized it. And I think as Vijay mentioned, even after reading the concept note you circulated, I thought I have nothing more to say. I think you seem to have captured all issues in a beautiful manner in that concept note. So I think what I'm going to talk is a very, very incremental type of insights into that. And I'm going to also, what Vishal presented at a macro perspective in terms of narratives and how these really work in terms of the type of solution which you come up with, the way you frame issues. And what Vijay Shankar mentioned in terms of the very specific issues, that 5 issues you brought out. So I'm going to see how I can pitch between somewhere and see whether I can make sense of what I'm going to say. So thanks once again. I have a very short presentation. Let me see if I can share the screen. Oh, where do I? Is my screen visible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I've tentatively framed it, and that is my main proposition, saying that in situations like this, whether it's pandemic, COVID-related pandemic today or something else tomorrow, I think by merely tinkering with the water sector, the policies and the present legal regimes is not going to help us much. And I think we need to clearly embed, and that is my main proposition, that we need to clearly embed the water sector in the environmental justice or the social justice frameworks. That's my main take in this brief presentation. I'm sure I would like to start with this saying we are all used to this, water as an important social determinant of health and well-being. I think, any literature you find about health, I think you mentioned among, water is an important determinant in terms of the health, and it's not only the medicines and other type of things, food, water, and good quality air are all supposed to be the social determinant of health and well-being. But I think during the pandemic, I think this whole thing again came back to us very sharply. The relevance of having access to good quality as well as in sufficient quantity of water, even to keep this, what Professor Arish also mentioned in this. But if this is the thing, what's happening actually? In fact, I'm sure some of you might have already seen the type of composite water management index of NITI Aayog, which came out in 2018. There are very stark figures which are they're talking about. One, it is saying that India is suffering from the worst water crisis in its history, and millions of lives and livelihoods are under threat. It also said that nearly 600 million, that's about half the population, face high to extreme water stress. In fact, it also said that nearly 2 lakh people, 200,000 people die every year due to inadequate access to safe water. And maybe by 2030, the country's water demand is projected to go twice the available supply, implying severe water scarcity for hundreds of millions of people. Now, it's not that we didn't know these numbers. Let me make it very clear. All of us who are in the water sector knew these numbers, but coming from NITI Aayog, it provided a certain sanctity to this number. we know that recently, who produces these numbers is very important to get legitimacy to the importance. So the Niti Aayog has spoken, which shows that. So if we say that water is a social determinant for health and well-being, then this is where we are standing. So probably we need to critically relook at using pandemic as an opportunity to see how, in what ways we can restructure, reconfigure water. So my effort would be to bring in some principles of governance in terms of even reconceptualization of water. We're going to do using this as a context. I think I would like to start my discussion saying that this whole is of, we have been using this word Anthropocene much more, frequently nowadays. Climate change, climate crisis, and I think keeping water within this broader framework is an important thing to see if we are to get a different narrative around water. So Anthropocene, as we know, that is the new and the current geological epoch in which the human being has become agent of planetary changes, because earlier days we were saying that probably human intervention did not make that much impact on the planetary systems as maybe other type of processes or ecosystem process or other type of thing. But I think today we have come to recognize that human intervention nature is becoming an important factor in terms of changing the whole natural processes and other things. And this comes with several endangering consequences for the survival of not only humans, but even other species and things. So when we talk about reconfiguring water, I think we need to take into account this important, this whole Anthropocene as an important reality today. So that will force us to rethink about the type of interventions we make in nature on our river systems and things, large dams or interlinking of rivers, the type of return flows we produce after the use of water, which has got a whole lot of water quality implications and other things, or the type of groundwater extraction, which I think Vijay did mention in his presentation and things. So I think we need to relook at the type of interventions we make in nature and broadly, and in terms of making water available and things. In fact, we are also talking about, this whole worldview and mindsets and ethics. I think it's an important thing when we talk about, trying to tease out what are the type of principles of governance in the context of things. In fact, I always like this, quote from Professor Ramaswamy Iyer, who had done, and all of us know about his work and things. So rivers are not human artifacts. I mean, the important point he makes is that they are not human artifacts. They are natural phenomena, integral components of ecological systems, and inextricable parts of cultural, social, economic, and spiritual lives of the community is concerned. They are not pipelines to be cut, turned around, welded, and rejoined. I think this is a sentence he has written, especially in the context of the interlinking of rivers, which he says that basically it's a tailoring effort. You cut, you stitch, and all type of thing. And we know that the river systems and nature cannot be done. But today, unfortunately, the dominant paradigm around water sees water from this perspective. I mean, that's why it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about reconfiguring water. In fact, this another mainstream saying which many of us have heard about, especially from the water establishment in the country, saying that any drop of water going into the sea is a waste. And the entire mindset about large dams and everything is actually embedded in this saying that, we should not, allow any drop of water going to the sea, because it's all to be harvested, stored for human use, consumptions and things. In fact, all our, whether it is groundwater mining or in terms of, stopping all water for human, this is actually around this particular saying. And unfortunately, most of our policy making or interventions are basically guided by this type of saying. And this is not only working at a larger scale, even in micro watershed, I've seen that people saying like, gav ka pani gav mein, khet ka pani khet mein. It might help us in conserve, but it doesn't really capture the complexity of water as an ecosystem resource, which I think probably Vijay also mentioned. It's an embedded resource, it's embedded in ecosystem processes. The type of forest cover, the type of land use what you have would determine how much fresh water you would get. At the end, there are many type of studies which have been done. So we need to realize that water is essentially an ecosystem resource, and so it's not easily manipulable. It is not, it's not, you cannot mine like other minerals and other type of things. So in fact, there are also very recent studies. In fact, actually this whole idea saying that this whole question of waste, in fact, that is an expression which you use in wasteland, for example. It has also came with a colonial type of meaning, which was given any land that does not earn revenue to the crown is a wasteland. That's how this whole term wasteland came. Today, wastewater also to some extent comes from that, saying that any water that doesn't earn revenue to you is wasted and type of thing. I think probably we need to get out of this mindset and things. In fact, there is also very recent research and very high quality research by the Ministry of Earth Sciences, which is a multi-institutional ocean mixing and monsoon, which they actually took up this whole issue about the role of fresh water going into the sea, the type of role it plays in terms of whether keeping the keeping certain runoff to the sea, especially from the rivers like Brahmaputra, Ganga, and other things, other river systems, major river systems and things, whether it in terms of helping keeping the ocean temperature properly, and also the salinity, for example. All these are issues are also related to certain amount of water need to reach the sea to keep all these things. And tampering with runoff from major rivers will impact coastal upwelling, basin scale ocean temperature, upper ocean mixing, salinity, ocean biology, and also dissolved oxygen concentration, as well as monsoon rainfall, etc., etc. So I think this whole paradigm of saying that no drop of water should go wasted into the sea need to be relooked. And I think probably this type of paradigm cannot help us in future and things, and we need to reconfigure our interventions to some extent. That's why nowadays we are hearing about closing basins, closed basins. There are studies to show that many of our peninsular rivers today, whether it is Krishna, Kaveri, really do not reach the sea in many years and things. I think the second aspect which I want to touch upon is, I'm not going to go into the details of this whole issue of hydraulic mission. In fact, hydraulic mission is basically three things are combined. One is that it combined, it also draws from the earlier discussion we had about science and technology. For example, we have a scientificism, an approach or a mindset about that, and an ideology along with that to dominate nature. And we also develop technologies to do this. And I think this was actually began in the late 19th century and became the hallmark of the 20th century, especially in the Western countries. Later came into South Asia and India, saying that all our large dams, all our whole water huge infrastructures, even today, even to provide very decentralized and dispersed needs, like, and as Vijay said, not even 5% of what is required to meet our lifeline or domestic water needs. Even here, we are actually going for grid systems and huge water infrastructure. I think Telangana is going for something called the 𝗪𝗏𝗪 system, where I think lakhs of crores of rupees are being spent in a centralized way of providing this. Now, these are things I think we can do in a much more decentralized, much more community-based, and even with whatever rainfall we get, if you have a proper prioritization and other type of thing, we don't need such massive infrastructure. Even the mention which Vijay Shankar mentioned about 𝗩𝗶𝗷𝗆 mission, I really don't know whether it is going to be a technocentric approach to solving a problem or something else. So people say that probably there will be taps in each houses, but that taps will have water or not is going to be a thing. So we are seeing the entire water sector from a what I call infrastructural perspective, the type of investments, and also huge contractors to run this also. I think probably we need to get out of this mindset to some extent of this hydraulic mission, though the Western society has moved out of this, but I think India is still stuck in this paradigm. I think this is something which you need to look at. The third context setting is that now we talk about climate change, climate crisis, and it has come to a stage now. Everything is because of climate. You have a drought, then there's a climate issue. There's a flood somewhere, there's a climate, and so climate has become the villain today. And it's very easy to. It's not only, especially the water establishment, the political class, the bureaucracy, all blame everything so that we don't need to anything. So the whole doing of climatization. I'm not saying that climate or climate crisis is a serious issue. We all accept that. But I think then in the process of climatization of everything or naturalization of climate change, I think the whole hardcore political economy choices you make, the type of developmental paradigm we are pursuing, and the type of interventions we make in nature are never problematic. So we need to clearly look at this whole tendency to do it. Thing. Accepting that climate is an important, or climate crisis is an important reality, but we also need to see that everything else is changing today. And along with that, there is also huge uncertainty. I think for me, climate change, apart from the extreme weather events which we talk about, I think from a governance perspective, I think the huge uncertainty which climate change or climate crisis brings in need to be factored into our thinking. And that's why now issues like stationarity. Earlier we used to talk about long-term averages over rainfall. In 100 years, we can say we used to say that so much of what is available at a particular dependability, saying that most of our dams, river sharing, etc., are based on certain type of dependabilities, like 75% dependability, how much water is there in the thing. But today, because of type of variation and other type of thing, probably we are not so sure about how much water we are going to get and things. So we need to factor in, saying that we cannot go by, certain things are much more dynamic, much more changing in the real world and things. How do you bring that into both in terms of the knowledge production? I think it's important that there's a whole huge knowledge gaps today, even in the hydrology science itself. We need to bring in some of these issues and things. So I think we need to recognize that we have a very incomplete partial knowledge today for understanding. I think that's the biggest. I think humans need to be humble enough to accept that what we know about water cycle, other things, I think probably is very partial, especially because of the climate crisis which is coming in things. And so when we talk about different principles of water governance, I think this is something which we need to factor in. In fact, there are serious implications of this when we talk about this whole climate change and climate crisis and things. Now, what does this mean? So I would clearly argue that our interventions in nature or river system need to be as per the contours of nature. I think this is one of the important learnings which I have learned over working in water sector for so many years and things. It's high time we recognize that we need to get out of the hydraulic mission mindset and see water as an embedded ecological resource, ecosystem resource and things. Then how do we choose, make an informed choice, the type of interventions we make. So integrity of river basins and the carrying capacity needs to be factored in all our developmental planning. I think it's an important principle, which I would say. Second, I would say that I would also say that the precautionary principle. I think this is something which many of us have been saying. And I think Professor 𝗪𝗳𝗲 has to emphasize, when the knowledge is incomplete, there is conflict in knowledge systems, then I think we need to we need to use precautionary principle, because even if we fail, then we fail on the safer side. I think for me, when you look at water sector over so many years and things, and with climate crisis and other things and pandemic coming into the fold, I think probably we need to be a little more circumvent in terms of this one. So it's a clear case of using much more in practice when you plan our water resources and water use, etc. How do we use this whole precautionary principle? Along with that, I would also say that what we used to say, I think it's important to restate and revisit the principle of subsidiarity, saying that if the water needs of a particular community can be met at a particular scale, at a lower scale like a micro watershed or a village level, then we should not demand water from a higher scale. So this can go against the whole grain of thinking related to large irrigation projects or interbasin transfers, ILR or interlinking rivers and type of thing. So we need to build from below, saying that what are the type of community needs in terms of water? Can we meet those needs at a particular scale, at a lower micro scale? If we cannot, so it gives that a much more of an iterative process, I think today. And today this type of planning is completely missing in the country. I think it's also high time it talks about rights of nature and things, rights of nature, rights of rivers. In fact, there is some talk about all these things, starting with the whole New Zealand experience, where they gave legal personhood to a particular river and things. And in our own country, I think Uttarakhand High Court gave a verdict a few years back about parts of Ganga and Yamuna getting a legal personhood, saying that it's certain rights. And very recently, a few weeks back, I think 𝗪𝗪 River in Canada has been given, and saying that the local communities are the custodians of the river systems. So this whole question of rights of nature and rights of rivers are coming to the foreground. I think we need to take an informed viewpoint. I'm not saying that we accept uncritically, but I think we need to look at the pros and cons of these debates and things and take at things. And one of the issues which is related to, which is coming into the policy regime today, is that environmental flows. Most of our policies, prescriptions talk about minimum environmental flows. I think we need to get into a mindset, we need a principle saying that it should be minimum extraction and maximum flow. That is important for downstream communities and also for keeping the entire ecosystem, the riparian systems in place and things. So this is something which I would say we need to pay attention. I would also argue saying that India should go for a Rights of Rivers Act. I mean, with proper consultations and other type of we need to go so that it provides a comprehensive legal protection to our rivers, including the right to flow, the right to meander, right to flood, and the right to meet the sea. I think this is a very important things, functions the rivers do. So whether we can go for along with the, let's say, water framework law, whether can we also have something like this, the proper discussions and debate and what type of thing which we need to go into this. I think the other important thing that so far the entire policy regimes has been, or the intervention has been to basically to augment water, more and more water. Entire efforts has been for supply side augmentation. I think we need to clearly shift to a demand side management and things. And here I would to say that, some of the people have written that, water security being equated with the per capita storage, which you can create on surface or the type of groundwater recharge and things. I think we need to clearly take a stand that among the different components of water, I think we need to privilege green water. Green water is the type of water you get to the soil moisture within this. So how do you harvest more and more water so that you not go for much, destructive type of surface storages and things. And also, I think we need to clearly look at grey water, the type of water which we produce after particular use, which we call return flows, the quality. So can we shift some of our needs to recycled water or these type of things so that the demand on the fresh water becomes much less. So I think there are a whole lot of spectrum. I think some of it, I think even Vijay mentioned in terms when he talked about agriculture, water use and things. Now, if 85 to 90% of the water goes into agriculture use, I think it's a clear sector where we need to look at demand management options, including the type of cropping pattern. Is it agroclimatically suitable or not? Or even drought-prone regions, we get, intensive cultivar sugarcane, which we all know that's a very high water guzzling crop. So looking at that, and there are a whole lot of institutions and other type of things in terms of how do you actually bring down the water footprint. I think every water saving should be in terms of overall, does it? I'm not only talking about agriculture, I think there is also a huge thing about industrial use. Today, most of the industrial water actually goes into thermal power plants. Now, can we shift to, instead of an open loop system, to a closed loop system so that much of the water can be reused and recycled and things. So there are very interesting possibilities which is there, and all these need much more policy incentivization we need to do that. A connected issue which I would like to just mention here is that we also need to reconceptualize our water use prioritization. Every water policy has a section which is one of the most important sections of the water policies are that, what is the type of water use prioritization? Like you have drinking water or domestic water, agriculture water, industry, so and things. But I think here this is a case, especially with the pandemic like COVID and things, or any other type of uncertainties and climate crisis and things, I think we need to privilege, which I call lifeline water. Now, lifeline water is a one segment of the domestic water today which goes. We all know that a bulk of the domestic water doesn't actually serve your lifeline needs. It all goes into luxury uses. And in fact, the more and more demand from the urban areas, from the rural areas, that is what, in a way, which Vishal mentioned, the whole question of water reallocation transfers which are taking from the rural to the urban, most of this water goes into the urban luxury needs, whether it is washing cars, private swimming pools, bathtubs, vehicles and all type of things. So can we not shift these uses to what I call the recycled water or the grey water and things, and use fresh water only for your lifeline needs is an important thing. So we need to, there's an area where we need to reconceptualize the thing. I would like to emphasize equity. I think even Vijay did mention about that. Now, how do you bring in distributive justice into this? How do you ensure a social minimum to all, to take care of, basically what I call the structural injustices. And I would say it's not only because of patriarchy and gender, I would bring in class and caste also, and ethnicity as important axes of exploitation and inequities in our society. And caste is an important thing in the Indian society. We all know that in many places we still have different drinking water sources for the upper caste and the lower caste. There are a whole lot of violences which are taking place on that, drinking water sources and things. And here I would like to just read a couple of lines to you from a very interesting poet called Namdev Dasal, who was a Dalit Pandar activist and a poet. And in fact, I would urge you to read some of his things. He says, "The fingers of thirst wither away while probing for edible beans, and man seeks compassion in a devastated body. The earth's mouth opens wide as a begging bowl. What a marvelous sight it is to watch your secular regimes wagging their tail. And he goes on to say that you will draw water upstream and we downstream. I think this is the whole question of upstream downstream relationship, and especially with that when you go to maps onto caste issues and things, you will draw water upstream and we downstream. Bravo, bravo, how you teach 𝗪𝗏 even to the water in your sanctified style. I think this is the reality I think all of us live in. So we need to look at this whole intersectionality of class, caste, patriarchy and ethnicity to, if you have to get this distributive thing. And there are also locational inequities in the water sector. One of the things we've been talking about that how do you de-link land right and water right so that the water can be made accessible, especially for productive uses, is one thing which has been experimented. There's a lot of experience behind this type of thing.
Finally, Joy, if you can just conclude in 1 minute.
Yeah, just 1 minute. So I think it also calls for an adaptive management, saying that the system should be flexible in the light of new information, knowledge. I think probably we need to, our managed system should be that we're not in terms of the type of bureaucratic thing which is taking place, so which can actually factor in the type of uncertainties which are there because of this. The last take or the type of principle which or insight which I have is that how do you create, how do you democratize the water sector in terms of creating legally mandated institutional spaces at different scales, whether it is a micro watershed to a river basins thing so that people can participate meaningfully. You can share data, information, and experiences, and also decide in a participative manner a local issue, and it also provides a forum to resolve contestation conflicts. Though I've been working in the area of conflict for the last 15 years, I don't think we have any mandated institutional spaces where people can come and negotiate and issues and this. So this is a very major issue which we find. So in short, my take is this. We need to reconceptualize the relationship between humans, or what you call the social relations, and between the humans and nature. I think these are two axes which you have to reconceptualize if you have to get our act together, and embed water sector in an environmental social justice framework. In fact, I would also actually just refer to Antonio Gramsci's work on how do the toiling people produce what you call counter hegemonies to the mainstream hegemonic discourse in the water sector. And there we need to involve local people, toiling people, in articulating their own alternatives to the present one. And that's a big task. And I hope to take up some of these issues. How do we do it, or how we can go about it? What could be a broad approach to it? Probably when there are questions or answers and things. So thank you, sir. I'll stop here. Sorry, I took a couple of minutes extra. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Joy. It was a really rich and wonderful presentation. I think this has really, for me at least, it has kind of brought to the fore the complexity of the challenge that we face, and the fact that simplistic answers and solutions or a simplistic diagnosis of the challenge is often counter helpful. It doesn't, and that one of the first steps, in a sense, towards addressing the challenge is to recognize the complexity.
Yeah.
And especially, I mean, of that very rich discussion, which where so many different themes were present. The last, I think the second last slide, where you talked of institutional spaces, it kind of tied once again. In my mind, it connected with what the earlier speakers were saying, because you see, again, going back to what Vishal was saying at the outset, that the knowledge about water needs to move, beyond just an engineering perspective and bring in a more interdisciplinary perspective that understands. So the question then, when I was thinking of that in light of what you talked about, is how does this happen at all institutional spaces? In other words, it's one thing for this to happen at universities, but then also there have to be institutional spaces within the community where knowledge is generated, where it is systematized, and that understanding of water has to be, in a sense, informed by these diverse fields of knowledge, if you will. An understanding of climate, hydrological concepts, agriculture. You could see how, and then also, like earlier, I think Joy was mentioning about indigenous knowledge systems. So it's very interesting. I'm sure we can explore more. And then also Vijay had mentioned about these legal frameworks, and so in a sense this discussion on institutional spaces also kind of ties to that, which is how do you legitimize the kind of insights, the kind of knowledge that is generated through these spaces? How do you give them teeth so that they can exercise agency in a way that is meaningful, that can actually bring about change? Okay, so I think it's a good point in our discussion to listen to Safa. She has the pleasure of being the last in our panel, so she can actually draw on the insights from our others and also respond to what has been shared, of course, in addition to what her own insights. Safa is a research scholar at the School of Geography and the Environment, the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at the University of Oxford. And she has nearly 10 years of experience with Saki Waters and Vasa. I hand over the floor to Safa.
Well, Joy started out on a lot of the things that I was going to talk about. Thank you. He laid out a lot of the foundation.
Sorry, dear.
You started like justice, and I was like, that was my whole talk. But then mine is a little bit conceptual, so that's a bit good. I want to talk about like taking Joy's conversation also forward a little bit. It's like building a coalition for a just water governance paradigm in this post-COVID world. Because we have known for a while that there are many things wrong with the way we practice water governance right now. And it has become more and more evident as we see COVID striking, and all of these realities are becoming more upfront and more in your face. And also how Vijay Shankar was mentioning that it's there. It's just now becoming so much more evident that we can't ignore it anymore. When anyone who has worked on water issues will have come across terms like integrated water management, integrated groundwater management, all of these terms and these ideas around water governance systems, and they're now thrown in policy. You find them in descriptions everywhere, and it's in any government water resources platform you go, you will find these descriptions of how we need to take care of it in an integrated manner. And where did these ideas about integrated water resource management come up from? They started from theory and practice in 1980s, and this built acceptance and took ownership at multiple, all of this repetition created acceptance in different platforms. And now that's become so prevalent, whether we wholly understand how we are implementing it or not is a different thing, but it has become part of our psyche and part of the way a lot of government officials are thinking about water. So this shows that the practice of water governance is not static. And as also Joy showed, there are all of these different ways in which we have been thinking about it. But right now, there is a need to move ahead. We need to, because the current approach is still hierarchical, is still following this very neoclassical way of thinking about water governance, thinking about this complex issue. But instead of looking at it like a complex issue, we break it down into its smallest parts. We look at water in either rural water supply, urban water supply, or just water sanitation hygiene, water quality. And while this analytical approach to water has helped advancing knowledge, we can't dismiss it, all of it, But it is not feasible to continue in this way anymore. As many of the panelists have spoken till now, it's that the reality of our world around us is complex, it's connected, it has so many multiple interdependencies that this way of fragmented and separated and isolated study does not benefit us anymore. Because by the time you finish studying one part of the system, the whole system has changed, and what you had studied is no longer applicable because everything has changed. What this practically means that if you're studying city floods, if you study only weather patterns, you won't be able to predict the next flood, because floods in cities are a product of not only rain, but also change in surface water resources, increase in built-up area, how the roads are paved, how the water supply systems are maintained, how the stormwater drains are maintained, the local politics of the city. All of this put together creates a flood. It is not only the rain or weather or climate pattern. So there is a need to reconceptualize the way we think about water governance. The principles of water governance need to be reconceptualized. While it started out with these three pillars of social equity, efficiency, and sustainability, I don't know if it is the narrative around it or maybe just chance that efficiency became the central pillar of this principles that are being followed, and the central pillar of efficiency became the vehicle to promote water governance. The issues of social equity and sustainability became something that you tack on later. And what this ideology of efficiency does is, in the name of efficiency, we ration, we regulate, we meter, we have these ideas of save water, every drop is to be saved at the source. And what this does is it creates a flawed way of looking at water. It creates separation between society, and it breaks a very human-centric approach to it. And then issues of when you look at efficiency, it would have been great if society were all equal. But the society that we live in is not equal. So then efficiency, in the name of efficiency, it benefits a very specific population of people who are capable of conforming to that efficiency or who can be part of it. Efficiency is not bad in itself. But when it comes to an engineering and economic idea of efficiency, it only benefits a certain section of society and leaves everyone, many society, and also the nature aside, because in terms of efficiency, then you save everything. In terms of efficiency, you regulate everything. In terms of efficiency, you create an economic incentive, you price it, you market it. And clearly we see that that system is not very efficient in a post-COVID world. There is a need for current systems to focus on values and ethics, and which is a very wide gap that we're seeing. And also Indian society has a lot of values and ethics associated inherently with our water systems. It comes from the way that we think of rivers as deities and worship them. But this ideology of efficiency of water governance has created a fracture in the way we think about it. So then on one hand, you have now this rhetoric of rivers as gods and deities, and you worship them, and the mighty Brahmaputra. And on the other side, you're looking at it as a resource to exploit. So it's the same person, and you're seeing these two contrary narratives coming out of development, of channeling, of cutting, of breaking up this natural deity into a resource, into a commodity. It's this dichotomy that we can't reconcile, because it's efficiency that is at the heart of water governance. And how do you shift it? How do you create then justice at the center? And why is justice at the center of water governance, not collaboration, cooperation, which are inherently something that water calls for? The nature of water demands that people work together towards it. But working together or cooperation does not always result in just outcomes. Private equity and governments can collaborate and cooperate together to create a system that marginalizes a lot of vulnerable communities and commodifies water and they can't pay for it. But if you center justice in the water system, that kind of cooperation would not be allowed because it is not an inherently just way of dealing with water. And justice is not limited. It's a universal quality, and its operation must be carried out in all classes, from the highest to the lowest. Justice must be sacred, and the rights of all people must be considered. So where do we go from here? We have all of these visions of, there are in the literature around water governance, there's all of these ideas of what a good governance means, but they have this ideology, and they're like this ideology to replicate in every way. And also it seems sometimes like a very distant dream. Transparency, accountability, all of these terms get thrown in a lot, but how do you transition towards just governance framework? How do you include right to water, participation, democracy, without making it rhetorical, time-consuming exercise of jargon and confusion? Again, there are multiple cases where a lot of informal water communities have come together. They have been a place where they took ownership and learned about their systems, how to they empowered themselves to get access to water. But also it required so much of effort. It required so much of time investment, energy investment to get access to these systems that are inherently structured in such a way that marginalize these bastis and informal settlements. It's time consuming. It is also very frustrating because they have to constantly engage with government, with all of the private entities to get access to something as basic and what they're demanded as water. So while participation and ownership is something that's encouraged, but it puts undue, it requires undue effort and excessive effort from the vulnerable to promote their cause more. There is a distinct power asymmetry. Do we wait until people are at the breaking point to shift to a more just system? What does procedural and systemic just practices then look like? Again, I want to emphasize water governance is not static. It's a shifting and evolving paradigm. If we want to shift to a more just paradigm, it requires consistent coalition of people working. The same way the ideas and principles of 𝗙𝗶𝗷𝗆 and the hydraulic mission was something that was repeated and put forward in different platforms, this idea of a just water governance system, where justice becomes a central pillar of it, needs to be promoted in every different platform, and it needs to be taken up ownership by academia, by civil society organizations, by everyone who's working in this field. It has to be formed not based on some ideals of a Western or a society from somewhere, but based in universal principles, a framework-based value of change. It requires representation from all different sections so that there is concerns that are unseen by one community can be put forward by another community. It requires ethical participation. It does, because often in the name of participation, we make people who are most marginalized, who do not have time, we ask them to participate more. The value of people's time is not taken equally. So there has to be ethical participation. And we have to develop dispersed knowledge centers around justice and equity. We have to break the hegemony of knowledge coming only from particular centers of knowledge. Knowledge comes from every aspect, and all of it, how do we equally value all knowledge systems? And there is another thing, we have to have consistency in the message that we are repeating. There is a lot of false, fake levels of information, and it creates dissonance in what is being said. Repeating, never underestimate the power of repeated messaging. There are so many things that we come to believe because the media constantly repeats that message. Why not we start repeating an idea of a just system? Making a lot of the things that are hidden connections, like a lot of have mentioned, there is connections between rivers, between lakes, between a lot of these systems, and they're interconnected. We need to start looking at them with these interdependencies and not look at them separately in their own silo. This does not mean that we plan and replicate ideology of what a society should look like, but have a framework centered around justice that encourages local innovation in a context that's dependent on what is actually there. And there is this quotation that says, "Be not dismayed by your endeavors, that they are dismissed as utopian by voices that would oppose any suggestions to fundamental change. Trust in the capacity of this generation to disentangle itself from the embroilments of a divided society." That is from my side for now.
Thank you, Safa, for this very insightful, and really there are so many insights that have to be unpacked that have come from this presentation and also the earlier one. I think one theme that Safa mentioned, and then Joy had talked about it earlier, which kind of stayed with me, and it's a thread from Vishal's presentation, is the tyranny of slogans, you know, in a sense, rhetoric. How much of our present policy and you know, the practices that define the way we look at the problem, the way we approach it, are adopted in a formulaic manner, because that's something is the ruling mantra of the field, and every solution has to somehow repeat that same mantra, and also the interesting thing in Safa's presentation is then she also mentioned that this has its own power in the sense of how discourse can influence action, because if you use it the right way and you ensure that a consistent set of ideas find are reaffirmed constantly, that they then this law of repetition begins to work for you. But anyway, I see there are many questions which have not been discussed, answered. I think the last one we discussed was, I think we need to discuss Suhas Kolekar's question. Do you think collective and participatory decision making will be key to co-production? So we've spoken of co-production of knowledge, but then the question of decision making, of participatory structures. And just to bring in what Safa mentioned at the end, which is also participation should be ethical. I mean, what does it mean? You bring these poor people who are working 2 shifts to stay, make ends meet. And in the name of participation, because you have, this is your mantra now, you say they have to sit for so many hours and, to discuss something which basically takes away from their time when they would be earning their livelihood. So what does it look like? Any insights or thoughts on how one stimulates, how one fosters participation in a way that is ethical?
Vijay, or somebody wants to go first? I mean, on this issue, I think it's a very important issue. Or
I think, Joy, if you set the ball rolling.
No, I think it's an important thing what Suhas has raised in the sense of this. So what I would look at is that yes and no, or what I call it in differently, that of course participation and especially decision making is what I call is a necessary condition if you have to really move to what you are saying, but probably may not be a sufficient condition. I mean, we make this distinction between necessary condition, the sufficient condition to make transformations and things. But I think necessary because unless people, as I said, unless you have legally mandated spaces to make decision making and other type of things don't change. Now, one example I would say is that the whole 𝗪𝗏 family, which was set up by Madras Institute of Development Studies, especially our good friend in the water sector, Janaka Rajan. In fact, 5-6 years, I think the family ran, the farmers of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu used to meet each other. They used to go visit, whatever type of apprehensions they had about each other in terms of water use, cropping patterns and things all found out. And they also came up with a water sharing formula. Now the issue is that moved parallelly because it didn't have a legal, basis for that type of a network or a, let's say, a stakeholder platform and type of thing. Now, if that had a legal mandate, or at least if the deliberations of that group or the forum had actually fed into the formal procedures of decision making in terms of tribunals hearing, because there was a tribunal which was awarding and type of thing, then probably these two could have met. But today they are going parallelly. So that's what I'm saying, that, okay, it's an important thing. And also, I think the issue of mindsets, I think, which is an important thing to clear. So understanding water, I mean, right from what Vishal said about the different type of narratives to what all of us spoke. I think it's also an important issue that how do you conceptualize water? So I think there is also a process of change and transformation which is required, and a new fresh look at that. Even so, participation may not be the only thing, it's an important thing, but I think we also need to bring in these new concerns into decision-making deliberation. Now, for example, equity. Very often I've seen that doesn't come very natural in the sense that people are so preoccupied with their own livelihood issues and other type of thing. Now, as a group which are concerned about that, if you can bring that into upfront into the discussions and into the decision making, then probably people do make equitable choices. So I think there are various examples which we need to bring. That should be a combination of all these. I think we have to make a transformative thing where participation, and this will be, I think, one of the first steps to move that. That's my broad take on that. Yeah.
I would say participation, I mean, a lot of discussion on participation anyway. Participation is largely a political kind of issue. The point is that, I mean, it's not just talking to people. I mean, dialogue is important. So first and most, I would say the basic prerequisite will be there will be some legal framework or something which allowing some discussions. That's why the legal legislating water is so important. Because unless you legislate and create some kind of a ground rules, community has evolved its own rules. Very often law takes on those rules and sort of enacts them to make a new legal framework. Those principles, all the principles that Joy mentioned, subsidiarity, all those principles need to be enshrined in a law so that communities can come together and discuss. So that law creates, therefore, a space for people to come together. But that's not enough. The point is that communities have to be organized also. I mean, if any equitable outcome, if you find in, let's say in Kerala or Tamil Nadu or any other place, wherever you find more equitable outcomes coming out of participatory processes, it's only because people are organized. So there has to be movements or organizations supporting them. And that should lead into creation of some people's institutions, like there should be some champions of people's institutions, like I mean, in Kerala case, it may be in a political party, or some other case, it may have been a caste association or a caste movement or something. It could be anything. I mean, there could be association of the people, poor people, that should be there as a movement supporting participation. So unless all these things are around, I mean, essentially, as Vishal initially put it, it's a political question. Unless this politically mandated, kind of politically empowered kind of intervention by the people who are deprived are there, the participation is not going to be solving anything. Yeah, that's what I would say. And the effort of organizations like ours should be to create such grassroots pressure in terms of forming communities and institutions of the poor people, so that they can use the existing legal spaces to move towards more participators.
Okay, can I make a small remark?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think that one also needs to refrain from necessarily glorifying participation as some kind of a panacea, as kind of a solution. I mean, in India, we had a whole decade of participatory irrigation management experiences in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. And I don't think that that the results were what we were anticipating. And so there was a time when everybody was doing PIM, participatory irrigation management. My PhD thesis was on participatory irrigation management. At that time, I used to come to 𝗪𝗏 with Seema and Joy and talk to what they were doing in Maharashtra. And there were so many issues coming up in that context. So that is one. Other is that participation, does not turn out to be a solution when we look at also the local power structures within the communities. So often you build a local governance structure and with the intention that you want to widen the net of decision making, you want to have local accountability and transparency, and then the whole structure gets hijacked by the local elite. So unless you have in place some kind of checks and balances, unless you have in place some kind of mechanisms to see how this gets operationalized. Participation in itself does not, this urge to build participatory institutions does not necessarily take us very far. So that is what I wanted to say.
If I may draw your attention, there's another interesting question in the chat box by Dr. 𝗪𝘁𝗲𝗿. I mean, he's perhaps the most knowledgeable about groundwater in India. So he has asked a question about the natural inequalities in the occurrence of, being a hydrogeologist, he would say there are certain areas where groundwater is available in plenty, certain others which is not available in plenty. So resources are necessarily unevenly distributed. So how do we link that to the kind of justice which Safa was talking about, environmental justice, or the kind of conflict situation that Joy pointed out? And how do we bring that into this frame of participation? How do we get participation of people who are located in very different and even deprived kind of situations? I think that's an interesting question to think about. So what would the panelists how would they respond to this question?
Can I just take a first dab at that? I mean, Himanshu is a good friend, so I'm feel okay. Actually, it's absolutely that water is distributed unevenly across ecosystems, and this we all know that. Now, I think the issue is also that this inequity in natural occurrence of water distribution, I think it's also in a way, I would say, with all guards which I'm building into my argument, saying it's also an anthropocentric way of looking at ecosystems. Saying that, the same rhetoric also was there in the interlinking rivers, saying that there are certain surplus basins and there are certain so-called deficit basins. So you transfer water from surplus to deficit. So I think the fundamental thing is to question this all assumptions we have. There are certain surpluses somewhere and there are certain basins. No, I don't think ecosystems work that way. All what you find is that within that ecosystems thing. So I think to conceptualize an issue like this, probably saying there is surplus, there is deficit, and is also, I think, probably a lens of what we see it and things. I think probably we need to step out of that and see how ecosystems function to some extent. That is, I think, would help us to begin a discussion of that type of thing. The second issue, I think, is that it's not only just water. See, water only one thing about your overall type of thing. So when you say that, okay, Ganga basin has got a particular type of a thing, or a Krishna basin type of a thing, then there is a whole lot of production, reproduction, distribution, lives, everything built around a particular ecosystems and things. So I think, so we need to also conceptualize things from that larger perspective of that. Otherwise, we will probably get into. And also maybe without transferring water also, you can have other distributive justices. Now, what is a grain bank does? You are not distributing water equitably everywhere, but what you produce through the water, you can pull it together and distribute to communities where you don't get access to. So what you produce through. So I think there could be different mechanisms of reconceptualizing equity in actual situations once you understand these type of limits. That's what my first take is. Yeah.
I would also say that I think Himanshu's question is also not about, not so much about interlinking perhaps. It's about that suppose we go along with an already existing divide, already existing kind of unequal situation. A typical example again is to go back to history, is that of Green Revolution. Green Revolution was taken up in those areas which were by definition water endowed. So it's not by accident or by policy neglect or by accident that the dryland areas or rainfed areas got neglected. They got neglected because the policy was not looking at them. Policy was focusing on certain kind of things. So it was actually in a way acting in a manner to deepen the already existing natural divides instead of trying to bridge them. So the human intervention, the way we intervene into the natural ecosystems should be in such a way, taking the point from Safa's justice perspective, to sort of enable people to come together, not to create or deepen their divide. And unfortunately, many, I think, interventions, particularly in the water sector, have been such that it has gone along with the existing water lines of the society and sort of enriched people who are already well endowed and deprived who are already deprived. So that way it has deepened social division. That I think is what the question was probably pointing to. Yeah, I would like to know what Safa would feel and Vishal's response to the question.
Yeah, I feel like it's a double-edged sword. It's like the chicken and egg. We have structured our environment so much within the urban environment and also moving to a lot of the riverine environments that we have changed the way we interact with it, and our behaviors have conformed to that infrastructural and this artificial structures that we have created, and we have acclimatized to that change. So then those who are living, like how Vishal was mentioning, in a gated community have become acclimatized to having that 24/7 resource of water. And those who are not, who have acclimatized to this a life of like living along the rivers, have built their own coping systems on how they deal with the flood or how they deal with scarcity. And we start to conform to those behaviors, and we start to, but that does not inherently make these behaviors correct or just behaviors. I don't know. There's a lot of back and forth to this question. I don't think it has like one answer. It's a reflexive looking at it.
And also, I think the same question can be dealt at a very micro scale too. I mean, look at this, even in a micro watershed. I'm sure Himonshu would, I mean, he has been also talking about, so it's not that we have a differential viewpoint about it. Now, even in a micro watershed, we know that the interventions for soil and water conservation we make in the upper part of the watersheds, and the water actually appears from the lower part. I mean, this is something like a natural type of a thing. Now, if my land is located in the valley portion where the water appears or the recharge and type of a thing, then I do get much more water, and though somebody else pay the price for the conservation and other type of thing. So how do you actually share what you call the costs and benefits of this is an important issue. Also, I think embedded in what is Himonshu's question, I think, yeah.
I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that question, or can we look at another one?
Yeah.
There's a question from Dr. 𝗪𝗳𝗀, which is, besides increasing biological contamination of wastewater from hospitals resulting in possibility of spread of waterborne diseases, but worse being the poisoning and toxic pollution of subsoil water with hazardous pesticides and related illnesses. What are your views on what needs to be done to stop this from worsening? I don't know if there's any comments on this.
I think there is this also comes from this idea of what is important and what do you give value to. A lot of us look at and how do you construct this idea of where things go. A lot of these problems arise from this urbanized structures of cities where waste systems, the priority you give to where the waste comes from hospital or where the waste goes from these urban sewage systems. A lot of them go into rivers, a lot of them percolate down into groundwater systems. And the considerations towards those are not as high and not considered as important as clean water that you get in your taps. So even if you look at a lot of government systems, even though there might be funding for creating sewage treatment plants, not even going to all of the problems of the existing sewage treatment plants that are not working, but just that willingness to work towards it and create systems that treat waste before it goes to into a lot of the freshwater systems. The priority for that is not very high. How do you stop this from happening? Mm-hmm. There is a need for a lot of revisiting ideas because it's an expensive process. It's an expensive process to treat water. It's a thing that has to be thought through a lot of levels. So it's like, what's the priority you give to the waste that comes out? We look at what comes in. We look at the quality of water that comes in. There is a lot more standards and a lot more regulation towards water supply that comes on your taps. But the one that goes out, there is very little consideration. I mean, there is some policy and regulation towards it, but the implementation of it and the, again, power to regulate that is much less than the ideas towards what comes in.
I just
yes.
But add to just to what Safa essentially said. I think what Dr. Meera has raised a very critical question in the water sector. I think probably it's we have not taken cognition of the issue of water quality. I think the way we should have done, the way we've done it for water quantity and this whole supply augmentation. So it's a very neglected area within the water sector, unlike in Europe. For example, the entire European water directive is primarily driven by the water quality question and things. And we have institutions. Now, for example, this whole, state pollution control boards are supposed to oversee all these things. But we all know how these institutions function. So I think I would say that one is that how do we make these institutions more accountable? In fact, there's a conflict of interest within the institution. Like one day, I was listening to Dr. Sharon Laley's presentation on this whole, how the whole state pollution control boards function. Who are the people there? Even there are also representatives of the polluting industries as part of this whole type of thing. So I think we need an institutional restructuring. And it's a very critical issue, especially in terms of pandemic and things. And also, for example, 𝗪𝗫 River is not only heavily dammed, but there are a whole lot of pharmaceutical industries are coming up on the banks of the river. And it's all incentivized by the Sikkimese government and reporting that they are getting new investment and things. There is no regulatory oversight in terms of where do this whole water goes back into the system and things. So I think people have been talking about unless you evoke some of the criminal procedures against some of these polluting things. Earlier principle was polluter pays principle, which is we all know it's a license to pollute because you can get away with some monetary type of a thing. Or even cancelling some of the licenses to given to this. So I think there are various things, or in the West, people have been trying environmental mediation, for example, to take up. But it's a very serious issue, I think Meera has posed, and all of us need to collectively think about and think and go beyond what is today. The first thing is that how do you make these institutions work for which they have been crafted?
I think water quality, I would quite agree with what Joy has said, that water quality is one of the most neglected kind of aspects. In fact, 10 years ago, we did not even have a very strong database, I think, in terms of water quality. You had this patchy kind of thing, samples taken from different villages. You take 2 samples from a village and say that village mein fluoride hai ya nahi hai. Yeah, usme arsenic hai ka nahi hai, that kind of thing. It was more oriented towards that kind of thing. There was no general understanding. But I also hear that last 10 years or something, there has been, as a part of the drinking water mission, etc., a steady build-up of information on water quality. And also I was talking to people from the National Institute for Urban Affairs yesterday. So they were saying that there's a fairly good database has come up about sewage discharge, the kind of wastewater which is coming in, the quality of wastewater, where is it going, and the kind of levels of treatment required. Industrial water, they were not very clear about. In the hospitals and industrial waste, they were not very clear. But at least sewage part, I think there's some data coming up. So we have probably an information base to act on. But point is that somebody has to act on it. Pollution Control Board, I mean, less said the better. I mean, we have a lot of experience of pollution control boards. So I think institutions have to be much more mandated to do a lot more. And quality issues somehow has not been central to our concern, which is very, very surprising, considering that that's directly something that affects your health and affect health of everybody in the family.
Vishal, you want your comment?
So just a very small remark. So while we talk about wastewater related issues and quality issues, the other side to it is that while we debate and discuss all this, there are a large number of farmers in the country using wastewater as an input into their agriculture. And a lot of the peri-urban agriculture research, draws a lot of attention to the value of wastewater as an input into peri-urban agriculture. Of course, it has its own health implications for the producers and the consumers. But especially in a context of changing precipitation patterns, changing access to water in peri-urban spaces, a lot of the research now draws attention to how widely wastewater is being used as a means of irrigation in the absence of other alternative sources. So just a small remark there. Yeah.
Another thing that I want.
Yes.
Another thing I want to add to this conversation about quality, and also a question that my mom raised about the role of media in solving water, is that the attention that is given to it. Media plays a strong role in building accountability and raising. And an assessment that I had done showed that we rarely talk about water quality issues. We rarely give attention as much as we give to demanding for water supply. 1/4 of it is even questioning about water quality. And water quality in rivers, in lakes, is also an issue of justice, because a lot of, while it's as a coping mechanism, a lot of this water is used for irrigation and farming downstream, but a lot of people also rely on the surface water as a drinking water source. And in absence of structured pipeline, and these are the more marginalized. So it's an issue of equity and an issue of justice. It's like those who are wealthier and those who have access to these sewage systems are causing the pollution, are causing a lot of these waste problems. But the consequences are dealt with people who are most marginalized. Whenever a flood happens, these things that are most polluted overflow, and those who are living the most vulnerable are the ones who are living in these informal spaces, are very close to these riverbanks, are very close to these lakes. And they are the first in line, they are the front line of consequences. So it's, how do we think about that? And how much attention, are we giving enough attention to it in media? Are we giving enough attention to it in regulation?
Thank you so much, Safa. Friends, we have overshot our time. So unfortunately, although it's the conversation is very interesting, and I'm sure we would like to continue, but we also have to somehow adhere to some time limits. So I think what we can do is have request our panelists to share one last parting thought. Maybe we can start with Vishal, and then we'll keep the space open for panelists to respond to the questions in writing if they wish, because there are many questions that have come and we haven't been able to address all of them. So Vishal, any closing thoughts?
Right. So what I will do is I will just share my final thoughts in relation to one more remark that was there on the question, which is about how do we look at gender and power differences. What is within our frame of reference? My only point there is that, of course, as Joy also said, I said that the issue of intersectionalities is basic to understanding the unequal distribution of water, and it needs to be made more explicit. It needs to be more explicit in planning. It needs to be more visible. It needs to be more explicit. So I think intersectionalities and making them more visible, because that's what shapes the differential water access. Yeah.
Vijay?
Yeah, I would close with the thought that whatever we have discussed so far, or the issues about water quality being the latest, or participation, or rivers, or climate change, or something, none of these issues are, none of it is anyway new. They all existed before COVID also. COVID has brought into the open perhaps, but otherwise the questions remain as relevant as ever. But this, I think, we need concrete action around them. There I would also say that there's a lot to learn from the work actually on the ground. I mean, we are at times people sitting in universities, etc., are a bit cut off from what actually happens in the ground. I think a lot of action is happening in different small ways in different places, done by the communities themselves, farming communities themselves, maybe NGOs, maybe some association of people. A lot of interesting experiences are there. We need to also collect them. So while many of the questions that we pose seem like in a way intractable kind of questions, solutions are probably already emerging, at least partly, to some of them on the ground. So we need to sort of learn more from such experiences as well. And that's the thing I would say.
Yeah. I know there are quite a few interesting questions which came up, and as Arash said, we don't have time to engage with them. But I think in case anybody wants to write to me about some of these issues, I will be definitely interested to respond to and continue this dialogue. I think that's okay. So in terms of the parting thinking, just two things I would like to say. I think one is also, I think apart from all the other things we talk about, legal, policy, and other type of issues, I think there is an issue of changing mindsets at different levels. I think that's an important thing. And I think that is one of the things which I picked up from all the speakers here also, and the questions came. And I think here I would like to re-emphasize, which I've been now talking more and about in terms of conflict situations, in that unless concerned academics or people who are primarily in the area of knowledge production and civil society or activists, I call, if they can work together, I think there's a case here. I'm now the policymakers and politicians, everybody is to be real. I think these are the two important constituencies in the water sector, I feel, who can make a transformative change in terms of new knowledge, and along with the civil society action to back it up or do this. I think it can have a transformative potential in terms of changing mindsets and practices and things. I think that is one thing which I would say. Second, I think is that, instead of just opposing, we don't want this dam or we don't want this and type of thing, I think we also need to get into what nowadays many of us talking about, alternatives. Okay, how do we build people's alternatives to, work with communities and people's, toiling people? and they articulate what about thing you need. I mean, just to end with what I said about how do you produce or make articulate counter hegemonies to the mainstream capitalist states, the way the whole development is being done. And here I think we also need to probably step out of water, also see other allied sectors and critique the overall, what I think Viju said about extractive development and things. So I think, so at multiple levels we need to begin, where I think this concept of bringing in alternatives, not only in terms in our own thinking and in practice, I think it will be one plank in which I think we can mobilize people around these issues. Yeah, that's.
It's a tough act to follow.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that, following from what Joy has mentioned, is that water is nested within a lot of other realities. We don't live in a world where only water is the, for those who are working on water, it's the central focus, but it's usually nested within a lot of other things. But one thing that we can do is bring that justice element into it. And how would we make it a reality? How would we, it comes from constantly reflecting on these questions of how do we make it systemic? Because while a lot of individuals, bringing out a lot of these individual stories which have changed, and there are a lot of these stories around, or a lot of these narratives are existing. How do we make these narratives more mainstream? And it can happen. Like we've seen, the shifts in water governance has happened. It has brought a lot of these issues into mainstream. It requires this coalition, and coalitions play a strong role. Of course, there's a lot of external factors that shift things, but people coming together and working towards a common cause has a strong emphasis in shifting the way we think about water issues nested within the whole world that we live in. So bringing in that in and picking in from what everyone has said is that bringing more of these justice stories to forefront, bringing and equity stories to the forefront, the rights-based stories to the forefront, changing the dominant narrative of how policymakers think about it, rather than efficiency and just efficient allocation and the best economic allocation. How would we make it a more just allocation, a more distributive, equally just distribution? And so everyone has to come together and consistently repeat this message and consistently make it the dominant thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. So on this hopeful note, this is something that has actually, even in our previous webinars on other development-related issues, one of the consistent themes that has been echoed in all these conversations is that there are a lot of positive prototypes which have emerged from civil society organizations. These need to be scaled up. And the path that...
I would say not only civil society, also farming communities, people themselves, communities themselves, yes. And also panchayats, all kinds of things. Even state-led initiatives also. We would not even discount states. Mm-hmm. There are lots of examples of work in different, yeah.
Exactly. Yes, like, yeah, they're exactly. So, and then the role of, Joy was mentioning, the academia in giving intellectual respectability to this knowledge, in mainstreaming it, and then gradually beginning to influence discourse. It is a theme that we have heard repeated, and it's a theme that I remember in our last webinar, there was talk of how the Right to Food campaign was really one of the cases which shows the power of consistent, sustained effort to bring about change, which bore fruit over a period of time. So, friends, all good things come to an end. Unfortunately, we have to, for now, say goodbye. I'm sure the speakers, if they are so inclined, they are free to share their email address on the Q&A, so that if any participants want to get in touch with them. You can also write, participants can also write to the Bahá'i Chair. The recording of this webinar will be shared on our YouTube and Facebook channels, and that through that it reaches a much larger audience. As I mentioned, we'll keep the webinar open for another 10 minutes, just to make sure that speakers, those who want to stay on and respond to the questions, can do so. Those who would like to leave are also welcome to leave, because it's gone beyond the time limit. So thank you to our panelists again for this really enlightening and thought-provoking discussion, and also to our participants for all the questions and for the patience in being constructive, collaborators in this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, friends.